Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. So Tu Bishvat is known as Rosh Hashanah Leilanot, the new year for the trees. And so I would like to talk about some trees in the Bible and in the midrash. Well, the Bible is full of various trees, fruit trees and idol trees used for building or firewood, yeah, as an object of worship or just as a metaphor. But this lesson will focus on three biblical trees. The first is the tree of knowledge of good and evil in the Garden of Eden. The second is the tree upon which Haman was hanged. In Hebrew, we use the same word, etz, both for the tree as well as for the wood which the gallows was made. So we'll talk about that in a minute. And the third is a less known tree, the one that Moshe threw into the bitter water of Marah in order to sweeten it. So at first sight, and maybe I should have shared the screen so you can see the beautiful PowerPoint thing I did here. Yeah, so at first sight, it seems that there's nothing in common between these three trees. But reviewing the midrashim about these verses reveals a surprising connection. In all three cases, the Bible does not tell us exactly what tree it was, and our sages in the midrash try to identify it. Why is it so important to identify these trees, and what are their conclusions? So these questions we will try to answer in this lesson. We'll start with the first tree that appears right in the beginning in the creation story of chapter 2. So we all know, I think Rabbi Galinkin discussed that also, that the first thing God did according to the second creation story is he created man, and immediately afterwards plants a garden in Eden, and there he puts the man that he created to work, to Ovdau Lashomra, right? So the first commandment that man receives, in fact, the first words spoken between God and man, is the prohibition against eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. As it is well known, Adam and Eve did not keep this commandment, and the midrash goes and asks, I didn't read the verses, but I'm sure that you know the verses, right? Vayita Adonai Elohim gan be'eden mikedem, vayasim sham et ha'adam asher yatzar. ויצמח אדוני אלוהים מן האדמה כל עץ נחמד למראה וטוב למאכל ועץ החיים בתוך הגן ועץ הדעת טוב ורע. So the last words, the tree of knowledge of good and bad, this is what we are going to focus at. So when we look at the midrash, Bereshit Rabbah, Genesis Rabbah, about this verse, the midrash asks, what was the tree from which Adam and Eve ate? Now we find here several answers. I can make it larger if it would be easier to read. No, I did not mean to move it. Just make it larger. I hope everybody can see.
Yes, please do.
And if not, I'll just, you'll have to trust me when I read it. So the question is, what was the tree from which Adam and Eve ate? Now the midrash gives us several answers to this question. And the first one is somewhat surprising. Rabbi Meir said, it was wheat. For when a person lacks knowledge, people say that man has never eaten bread of wheat. Okay, so the first answer to these questions, I'm quite sure if I would ask any of you, what was that tree? I believe no one would say wheat for several reasons. Okay, so why did Rabbi Meir suggest this? I think Rabbi Meir is pointing at a connection between eating wheat or bread and having knowledge. A sort of a very basic knowledge that every child gets at some point after giving up nursing and starting to eat real food. So this is a very basic idea of knowledge. And yet, this is a strange answer. not only us, even the sages themselves were surprised by this answer, because immediately after Rabbi Meir, the Tanakh, the sage of the Mishnah, we find some kind of a discussion by the Amoraim, the sages of the Talmud and the midrash, and they try to clarify this matter. So Rabbi Shmuel ben Yitzchak asked Rabbi Zeira, is it possible that it was wheat? Yes, he said, but surely tree is written. It says the tree of knowledge, not the grass of knowledge. So how could it be? It grew lawfully like the cedars of the Lebanon, he replied. Okay, so this, we actually have two kinds of plants in this one answer, because it's wheat, but it is also tall as a cedar tree. So this is some miraculous kind of wheat, not something that we know, but in the Garden of Eden, we could find probably plants that we do not know anymore. We don't have them in our real world. So this is the first answer. The second answer is given by Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda ben Eli said it was grapes. For it says, their grapes are grapes of poison. They have clusters of bitterness. This is from Shirat HaAzinu in Sefer Dvarim. So those clusters brought bitterness into the world. Now, this answer makes more sense, because grapes are indeed more likely to be called tree. And also, when we think of the symbolic meaning of this plant, right, we make wine out of grapes, we can easily understand why Rabbi Yehuda chose it. He's probably thinking of the bad things that wine can cause, like the sin that could be caused by wine. The third answer is that of Rabbi Abba of Akko, and he says it was etrog, as it is written, and when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, so he is trying to make it clear using the exact words that the book tells us. Consider, go forth and see what tree is it whose wood, etz, can be eaten just like its fruit, and you find none but the etrog. This is a midrash that Chazal also use when they talk about the mitzvah of Sukkot, of the four species, the four minim. So they say etrog is a kind of fruit that tastes, the fruit tastes just like the tree, the branch. I've never tasted either, so I don't know if it's true, but I believe them when they say so. And they use this midrash here too to describe how do we know that this was etrog, because it says what we saw in the verse. No, we didn't see it in the verse because I didn't bring you the verses, but it says Vatere ha'isha kitov, right? And kitov ha'etz lema'achal. The tree is good for eating, so therefore this was etrog. That's what Rabbi Abba says. It's a kind of a very Talmudic way of thinking when we look at it. So what we see, in any case, we just moved from regarding the tree of knowledge as one of the 7 species, right? We saw wheat and grapes. Then we moved now from Shivat HaMinim to the 4 species, right? Of Sukkot, instead of those of Bikurim. So either way, whether it's connected, whether it's one of the 4 species or one of the 7 species, we're still talking about plants that are connected with the land of Israel and of the Jewish practice, either from the first fruit or Sukkot. Now comes a different answer, and this is the answer of Rabbi Yosef. Rabbi Yosef said, they were figs. One learns the obscure from the explicit, and a statement from its context. Thus, this may be compared, before that. So what Rabbi Yosef says is that we know, I was asked to make it larger. I don't know if it makes things better for everybody. So if we say that the fruit, the tree of...
It was larger before Gila.
It was?
Yeah.
Okay, then I'll change it anyway. I hope I can. See, that's why I didn't do it in the first place. Now how I get out of it. Okay, I'll keep
better.
I'll keep it this way. Okay. So Rabbi Yosef says that the tree of knowledge was figs, which really makes sense because actually that's the only name, the only tree that is mentioned in the story is the fig tree, of which Adam and Chava made their covered themselves with the leaves. And we should notice, of course, that the fig tree is also one of the 7 species, which I mentioned before, Shivat Haminim. But what Rabbi Yosef also does, or maybe not him, maybe the midrash, but it gives us a nice parable to explain why would the fig be one of these options, or why would the fig be the answer to our question. So this may be compared to a royal prince who sinned with a slave girl, and the king, on learning of it, expelled him from court. He went from door to door of the slaves, but they would not receive him. But she who had sinned with him opened her door and received him. So we can easily understand what this parable means. But Rabbi Yosef also explains, but because he had eaten of its fruit, the fig tree opened its doors and received him, as it is written, and they sewed fig leaves together. So we have here an explanation, probably the best of all of them, although I don't remember seeing the tree of knowledge described as a fig tree. We all know as an apple tree, but I'm not going to go into that thing that came quite later after this midrash. I believe it came from the Christianity art. In any case, this is not the last question, the last answer to our question. There's another answer. But we should notice something strange about this parable, because it changes the order of the way things happen. In the parable, the sinner, right, the prince, was first expelled and only then found the open door of the fig tree of the slave, which is not quite the way the story we had the story in Bereshit. Also, we should notice that this specific story is trying to hint us to what kind of a sin we are talking about. The prince who sinned with the female slave I don't think it's an accidental or random story. And we should also have in mind that our sages used the different stages of a fig fruit as metaphors of the stage of feminine puberty. So it seems that a connection is made here between the tree of knowledge and other biblical meaning of the verb to know, as in Adam knew his wife Eve. And if this sounds a bit too Christian to you, perhaps that is why the midrash goes on and brings a 5th opinion. And this opinion is brought to us by Rabbi Azariah and Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Simon in the name of Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. And what he said is, heaven forbid that we should guess what tree it was. The Holy One did not and will not reveal to man what the tree was. So after giving all these nice answers, wheat, grapes, etrog, and fig, the 5th answer is that we should not even try to answer this question. The midrash concludes with the understanding that this question should stay unanswered, that it is a secret, something that is better left unspoken. It was a unique tree, not one of those that we know today. So this is the first case here. We asked the question, what tree was it? And we finally find ourselves without an answer, or we should not have an answer to this question. I would like to now move to the other side of the Tanakh, where we find another tree, the one that Haman planned to hang Mordechai on, but eventually was hanged on it himself. Of course, it doesn't have to be a tree, though you can see here in the picture from the Frankfurt Machzor, I think from the 15th century, if I'm not mistaken. So sometimes the Jewish artists did draw it as a tree, but again, this comes from the Hebrew word for tree, which is etz, and it's the same word for wood, the product that we have from the tree. So the sages use this double meaning of the word etz to create a midrash, which again starts with a question. But first, we will read the verses that this midrash refers to. So this is from Megillat Esther, chapter 5, verse 14. ותאמר לו זרש אשתו וכל אוהביו, יעשו עץ גבוה 50 אמה. Well, you can see יעשו עץ obviously means that it's not a plant, but still the midrash insists of treating it as a kind of tree. ובבוקר אמור למלך ויתלו את מרדכי עליו, ובו עם המלך אל המשתה שמח, ויטב הדבר לפני המן, ויעש העץ. So this proposal pleased Haman, and he had the stake put on. Now the midrash starts with a very similar question. This is a lot of text, so I hope we can be able to see it. This comes from the midrash Esther Rabbah, parasha Tet 9. And the midrash asks, what kind of tree was the stake made of? Or in Hebrew, מאיזה עצים היה אותו העץ. Here you see the double meaning of the word etz. Okay, so it starts with the question, and then our sages said, when he came to make it, God called all the trees of creation and said, which will offer itself for this wicked to be hanged on? Notice the word trees of creation, which sends us back to what we started with, the story of Bereshit, as if to say, from the beginning, God planned a tree to be created in order to hang Haman on it. So here the trees become part of the story. It's not only we try to identify, but we see that the trees actually take part in the story. The first one is the fig. The fig tree said, I will offer myself, for from me Israel brings first fruit. And what is more, Israel is compared to me, as it is written, like the first fig to ripen on a fig tree. This is from Hosea, kevakura. So Israel is compared to a fig, and that's why it's very appropriate, says the fig, that I will give myself to hang Haman Harasha, the enemy, on me. And then the grapevine says, I offer myself, for Israel is compared to me. As it is written, you caused grapevine to journey out of Egypt. Gefen mimitzrayim tasia. That's a famous verse from Tehillim, from the Psalms. And then we'll do it kind of fast because it's a very long list here. The pomegranate says, I offer myself, for Israel is compared to me. And there's a verse from Shir HaShirim. And the nut tree says, I offer myself, for Israel is compared to me. Another verse from Shir HaShirim. And the etrog says, see, we already have three trees that were referred to in the first midrash. The etrog said, I offer myself because Israel takes me to perform a mitzvah. And so the myrtle, the hadass, also says, I offer myself because Israel is compared to me. And then the olive says, and then the apple says, and then the palm tree says, and then there are the acacia trees and fir trees that they offer themselves. They don't have a verse, but the tabernacle and the temple were built from these trees. And then there's the cedar tree, which we also saw before. because of the verse Tzadik katamar ifrach ke'erez balevanon isgeh, right? The righteous bloom like date palm and they thrive like cedar of Lebanon. And the willow said, I offer myself, for Israel is compared to me. And also they take for a mitzvah of the 4 species. So we have a very long list here, and you will probably not be surprised to notice how many trees are mentioned here or how many trees speak here. If we count the acacia and fir as one, because they only have one saying, then anybody?
10 or 13.
Aha. So let's see. There's a fig, a grapevine, a pomegranate, a nut, an etrog, a myrtle, an olive, an apple, a palm, the building trees, the cedar, and the willow. Altogether, we have 12 trees. Not very surprising, because what we see here is really like a gathering of all kinds of trees that are supposed to remind us of the tribes of Israel, right? Together. It's all also might remind us of a very famous story, Yotam's parable in the book of Judges, where also there's a question, and only there every one of the trees does not want to be the one chosen. So if we have the parable of Yotam in mind, we probably know how this story is going to end. It ends with a thorn. Okay, so at the end, after all these 12 tribes, 12 trees that are all compared to Israel and therefore kind of represent Israel in all kinds of ways, then comes the thorn and says to God, Master of the universe, I who have no reason to exist, offer myself to have this impure one hang from me. For I am called by the name Thorn, and since he is a painful thorn, it is fitting that a thorn be hanged on a thorn. And so it was made of it. So eventually, Haman, according to this midrash, was hanged not on a tree, but on a thorn. And actually, if we look again at that picture that I had here before, you can see that it is some kind of a thorn, probably. You can see the parts that are, sharp over there. I think, I'm not sure. Maybe it's a kind of tree anyway.
If you're looking at the bashal, at the atad, because you're talking about the atad. Atad is also a kind of a tree because it's a thorn tree.
It's a thorn bush, I believe.
It's
right?
a thorn bush, but it can be like a fairly large tree. So it could very well be that it was the atad, the actual thorn tree.
It might be, although the Hebrew here doesn't say atad, it says kotz.
Yeah.
And I think this is important because this is not the only place where Haman is compared to a thorn. This is actually a very common midrashic notion. For example, in the Babylonian Talmud in Masechet Megillah, there's a midrash about the verse "Tachat hana'atzutz ya'ale brosh v'tachat hasirpad ya'ale hadas." Na'atzutz is probably a kind of a thorn of quotes, and also one might be familiar with the famous piyut, "Atz kotzetz ben kotzetz ktzutzai lekatzetz." This is often brought as an example for the impossible tongue twisters of the piyut language, but really the words "atz kotzetz" refer to Haman as a kotz. Okay, so the idea that Haman is like a thorn, a kotz, and the idea that Am Yisrael is like all these trees, fruit trees, is a well-known idea. Only here the Midrash brings these two ideas together and describes the tree on which Haman was hanged. Okay, so the third, I'm really out of time now. I should be doing it faster now. The third tree, and I think the most relevant for today, is the one that Moshe threw into the water in order to make them sweet. So this is from Shmot Tetvav, which is actually Parashat Beshalach. This week's portion is always read on the Shabbat close to Bishvat. How appropriate. So right after the crossing of the Red Sea, Bnei Israel find themselves without water. And when they finally get to the water in Marah, they are bitter water. They cannot drink them. So Hashem says to Moshe that he should throw a tree into the water. And now the midrash does not ask the question, but we can see from the midrash that it deals with the question, what was this tree? So I'm reading from the midrash of the Tanaim, Mechilta de Rabbi Ishmael, the midrash to the book of Shmot. And the Lord showed him a tree. Rabbi Yoshua says it was a willow tree. Rabbi Elazar of Modi'in says it was an olive tree, though you can hardly find anything more bitter than the olive. Rabbi Yoshua ben Korcha says it was an ivy. So all these identifications say that it was a very bitter tree, and that makes it even a bigger miracle, right? Because if you sweeten something by a bitter tree, then it's even a bigger miracle. By Rabbi Yoshua ben Korcha, it's even bigger because it's a poisonous tree. And then comes a different answer. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai says, he showed him a teaching of the Torah, for it really says, and the Lord taught him, Vayorehu, right? The Pasuk says, Vayorehu Adonai Etz, not he showed him, but he taught him. Just as in the passage, and he taught me, Vayoreni, and said unto me. Okay, and there's another, all kinds of other answers. Rabbi Natan says it was a cedar, and some say it was a root of fig tree and the root of a pomegranate tree. You see, Chazal keep using the same trees. Those are the trees they know from their close area. But the last answer here, the allegoristic, Dorshei Rashumot, say, he showed him words of the Torah, which is likened to a tree. As it is said, she is a tree of life. Etz chayim hi lamachazikim ba. We all know that verse. So what we see here is, again, a list of trees, but at the end, the final answer is none of them are really the right answer, but we should think not of a real tree, but as the Torah, which is compared to a tree. In other words, what Moshe used to sweeten the water was really the words of the Torah. So in all three midrashim, it is quite clear that the question, which tree was it? This question does not derive from pure botanic curiosity, but from the motivation of sages to understand what the Torah is teaching us. Behind the question, what was the tree from which Adam and Eve ate, hides the question, what was really the original sin? Behind the question, what kind of tree was the steak of Haman made of, hides the will to praise the people of Israel and condemn its enemy, Haman. And behind the mystery of this sweetening tree stands the interpretation connecting both water and trees with the learning of the Torah.